For US-China relations, certainly this is a breaking point. They've not been good for a long time, and Trump was the first US president I think, to really properly, aggressively call out China by initiating a trade war. And coronavirus has just given him much more ammunition.
Hello, today I'm talking to Cindy Yu, political reporter for The Spectator and broadcast editor, writes on China and many other issues. Cindy, how are you doing? How are you coping with the lockdown?
Yeah, all right, actually. I've got a nice balcony, so I feel like I'm one of the lucky few in London.
You've been writing a bit about the current coronavirus pandemic and its relation to China, where it originated. Could you possibly talk a bit about that? How did it start and what's been the reaction in China?
So, I mean, that's the big question. How did it start? At the very beginning, the Chinese government was saying that it started from this Huanan seafood market, this wet market, where you had lots of wildlife and people going around. The hygiene wasn't necessarily up to scratch. But following that, there have been scientific studies that show actually a lot of the early patients had no links to the seafood market whatsoever. So the big question now is, where did this virus begin? And I'm told by people who understand viruses much more than I do that it's actually very, very hard to track something like this to the very beginning. So it could be for the seafood market. There are obviously conspiracy theories out there that is released by military labs near Wuhan, that sort of thing. Basically, none of us know at the moment. But what we do know is that at the end of last year in Wuhan, this virus started developing and jumping onto people and mutating itself.
And what's been the response and the reaction in China itself? Because I was thinking when this started, it's a bit of it's not a pleasant thought, but if there was anywhere in the world with a political system that could act quickly and swiftly and lock things down, then China perhaps would be where I'd think. But how have they responded?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once it acknowledged that there was a problem, the lockdown was very swift. Wuhan itself was locked down within 8 hours, so people had very little notice to get out. Lots of people were trapped there if they were accidentally there at the wrong place at the wrong time. And since then, the rest of the China has been under lockdown as well. So Wuhan itself, no one has been in and out the city until last week for 76 days. That's how bad the lockdown was. For the rest of the country, it's what we have in Britain at the moment, which is just to stay at home as much as you possibly can. Some cities introduce shopping permits and policed how many people of what each household left and left their apartments and all that sort of thing. But the problem with the Chinese institutions is that, yes, it can lock down very fast. On the other hand, there's a big question mark over how transparent it was being at the very beginning of this situation. I wrote something about this at the end of January for The Spectator, which is that this is a double-edged sword. You have a dictatorial system where lockdown happens very fast. But at the same time, because it's a dictatorial system, people don't want to feed bad news up the ranks. So how much did China know at the very beginning? Did it dither and delay too much? And could that have changed the situation for the rest of the world? We just don't know yet. And there's a lot of journalism doing very good work on discovering what cover-up there was and how high up that went.
Okay, interesting. And the national picture in the UK, we've been on lockdown for about, I think this is the 4th week. I'm kind of losing track of time as we're getting progressively deeper into it. It's been fairly severe, but not as strict as in some other places. People can still go out to parks and exercise and run. We've had a few dodgy incidences with the police, maybe overstepping a little bit. And we're at over 10,000 deaths in the UK, and I think the goal is to keep it under 20,000. But what do you think about, what are you seeing in the British political picture and how we're reacting to it?
Well, I mean, this is a difficult question. This is a new pandemic for everyone involved, especially for people in the West, at least the East Asian countries, they were so quick to react because they had the dry run of SARS in 2003. For Western countries, we've never had really anything quite like this on home turf. So there has been some dither and delay in the British side. There are big questions to be raised about why we weren't stocking up on ventilators in February, why we weren't buying more PPE. There are reports that the PPE that we did have ran out of date in 2015. So lots of questions about preparedness. And I think I can safely say that there will be an inquiry into the British response after the current fire is put out. But at the moment, people are just focusing on getting through this at the moment. And what's interesting is that public opinion is supporting A, the lockdown, and B, the Conservatives in what they're doing. And I think that's fascinating. This is real uniting around the flag moment where you've got a national hardship. And especially when Boris Johnson was in hospital last week, people just didn't really want to hear a blame game. I think that might change in the coming days because, as you say, we are in the 4th week of lockdown now. How much can people really last with this, even on just like a psychological level? We're lucky, we're young people, we don't have children, we've got park gardens and our balconies. You've got families who are having a much tougher time with it. So is public opinion going to stick with the government in the weeks to come? I'm not sure. As we're recording today, Keir Starmer announced that he wanted the government to publish their exit strategy. So with a working opposition now in place, is that going to be more difficult for the government as well? We just don't know. But so far, it actually seems like the government has had more support than, if you asked me a month ago, would people support a Conservative-led lockdown? I probably said no.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially when you talk about the Conservatives themselves and the current political situation, because it wasn't long ago that Brexit was the big thing that we were all battling about for 3 years. And the party and the country looked completely divided. And now coronavirus really puts everything into perspective, and it feels like everyone's kind of coming together. But also the Conservative Party itself is undergoing it was undergoing a revolution under Boris Johnson, and now there's like a second revolution going on. So do you think that this spells a kind of transformation for the Conservatives, kind of replacing Euroscepticism with more China skepticism as the new dividing line, bringing production and supply lines back overseas to the UK, and a more kind of big state communitarian conservatism as opposed to the Thatcherite free market conservatism that many people are more familiar with?
I think that's a really interesting question. On the China front, I definitely see more Sino-skepticism than there have been in the last 10 years. Under David Cameron and George Osborne, it was all about the golden era. And at the time, you had right-wing pundits criticizing them for kowtowing to the Chinese. Now, I think that is politically impossible, any sort of kowtowing, fair or not. When we're talking about China at the moment, we were hearing from briefings to papers like the Mail on Sunday about a reckoning that's coming for the Chinese government as soon as this current fire is put out. That inquiry into how much did they know and whether or not the situation for Britain and the world could have been different if the Chinese Communist Party was more forthcoming about what they did know. So I think that is going to have implications on future China policy, such as for Huawei. I don't think we're going to, we haven't been giving Huawei much time of day already, and I doubt that's going to become better for the Chinese side in the years to come. I think there is going to be a harder clamping down of whether or not China can be a real respectable partner in all of this. And on the communitarian side, that's really interesting as well, because Rishi Sunak in the press conference last week said that we're going to get through this if we work with each other. That is a sort of one nation tourism message that people who thought Boris Johnson was definitely keen on, but at the moment there's a new impetus for it. After this crisis, I don't think you're going to be able to see Conservatives as the nasty party when it comes to healthcare anymore. The NHS has now become so important, and we can see its function, and this is so crucial in our mindsets, especially with Boris Johnson having just come out of hospital himself, that I think the Conservatives are now going to be a big spender when it comes to healthcare. The question is whether or not it can spend cleverly. We see from social care, for example, that even it's not necessarily a focus, paying lip service to healthcare that's important. We actually need to have actual reforms to make things better. And so that social care in the future is not just something that you sweep under the carpet.
Moving away from the UK and to more of the international picture, in Europe, there's been a decided lack in the EU of solidarity between the North and the South. Spain and Italy feeling left behind, having been hit quite severely. Spain, I think now about to start easing its lockdown. The EU kind of fighting amongst itself over something called Corona bonds, which I'm not going to pretend to understand. Do you think that this spells, maybe not the end, but a change or a challenge to the EU, another financial crisis, another kind of reckoning with China from Europe's point of view, bringing their supply chains back from China?
I think that's easier said than done, to be honest. There's a reason those supply chains are in China at the moment, and that's because of cheap labor costs, loose environmental restrictions, and that sort of thing that makes business, it makes it more business friendly, manufacturing friendly environment. We are seeing a change in supply chains, but that's more towards Vietnam and other South Asian countries rather than back into the West. And that's natural. Comparative advantages change. Chinese labor is getting more expensive as the minimum wage rises, as China becomes more developed itself. But moving it back to the West, I think until we can 3D print our own textiles on a mass scale, that's not going to be possible realistic. But in terms of for the EU, I think there was a moment of maximum danger for the EU about 2 weeks ago when Italy, oh gosh, not 2 weeks ago, a month ago now, time flies when you're in one room, when Italy was really struggling with the situation, and it was the Chinese that were giving medical supplies, not the EU, to Italy. That is some people have called that opportunism, and of course it is. But at the same time, why didn't the EU take up that opportunity? So that moment was very dangerous for EU solidarity. Since then, the EU has done much more to make sure that its member states are supplied. But at the same time, institutionally, it doesn't have that much power in this sense, in the public health sense, as nation states themselves do. And it also doesn't have the resources that China does. I don't think this will be a pivotal moment for EU solidarity. But I do think that, the EU needs to be clever about it, especially in the face of some players that's so opportunistic as China is.
Finally, just to kind of finish off, the more global picture, looking at the US and China, it's the year of the US election. Donald Trump or Joe Biden could be elected later this year. Both are conservative. One is more of a China hawk, Trump, but you also see Trump kind of tearing up what people have called the liberal international rules-based order. Just today or yesterday, I think, he has announced the US isn't going to fund the World Trade Organization anymore, which itself has some questions to ask in its relations with China. What do you think this says for the future of geopolitics with a kind of increasingly fragmented world, countries looking more to China as it expands its own Belt and Road Initiative, and the US, currently the world hegemon, but really kind of stepping back from the world stage as China rises? So what do you think this spells for, sorry to leave on such a huge question, for the future of world politics?
Well, for US-China relations, certainly this is a breaking point. They've not been good for a long time, and Trump was the first US president to really properly aggressively call out China by initiating a trade war. And coronavirus has just given him much more ammunition. A part of it will be electioneering, because China bashing always wins you points in American elections. But I think a part of it is long lasting. Even though Democrats have been criticizing Trump for pulling funding from the WHO, they still also are China hawks when you look at their attitudes towards Huawei. So I think that's a irrevocable change in the American position. On the world stage, it depends on what country you ask. China has its friends, America had its friends, although it is very hard to ally with Trump's America because Trump is a difficult, reliable ally to have. He can even threaten tariffs on Canada and Europe. So he's not necessarily the most reliable ally. But at the same time, it really just depends on which country you ask. I think a lot of Asian countries closer to China will be much more leaning towards America, just for pure balance of power reasons. Whereas some countries in Africa will be, and Eastern Europe as well, you've seen being very friendly towards the Chinese approach. So we're at this. We've been having this unipolar moment in global politics for a long time. Now there's a second pole coming out. Who's going to jump on whose bandwagon? That's the big question. But I do think that China is just, China, this is not a good situation for China to be in. If it does win the corona wars, it's going to be a Pyrrhic victory. It's going to be as damaging to itself and it probably wouldn't have been worth it.
Well, thank you very much. That was brilliant. I am amazed how much we managed to get in there in that period of time. But Cindy, thank you very much.
Thank you.